The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council was the largest room ever built by living hands. It floated inside a station that orbited the neutral world of Varith Prime, far from any empire's border, far from any star that anyone could claim. The ceiling rose so high that clouds sometimes formed near the top, little wisps of moisture that drifted between the light panels like ghosts. Thousands of seats curved in wide circles around a central platform, and every seat belonged to a species that had earned its place among the stars. 40 years ago, humanity had walked into this room for the first time. They had come with wide eyes and nervous smiles. A young species, barely 2 centuries into space travel, still amazed that the universe was full of life. The Council had granted them provisional membership, which was a polite way of saying they were allowed to watch, but not to matter. 40 years later, not much had changed. Ambassador Ilara Mwangi stood at the speaking platform and looked out at the rows of alien faces. Some had scales, some had feathers, some had no faces at all, just clusters of sensing organs that pulsed with light. She had spent 15 years in this chamber, and she knew every delegation by name, by habit, by the way they voted. She knew which ones respected humanity and which ones simply tolerated them. The second group was much larger than the first. Today the Council was voting on the redistribution of frontier rights. This was the policy that decided which species could colonize and develop the unclaimed sectors of the Orion Spur, a vast stretch of space rich with resources and habitable worlds. Humanity had explored several of these sectors. Human ships had mapped them. Human scientists had catalogued their planets. By any fair measure, Earth had earned a significant share. But fairness was not how the Galactic Council worked. The elder species controlled everything. 3 powers sat at the top. The Valith Dominion, an ancient civilization of tall, silver-skinned beings who believed that age was the same thing as wisdom. The Kirath Collective, an insectoid hive species that moved as one and thought compromise was weakness. And the Orun Hegemony, a race of massive, slow-moving creatures whose technology was older than most stars in human space. Together, these 3 had held power in the Council for thousands of years, and they had no intention of sharing it. Mwangi had submitted 7 amendments to the Frontier Rights proposal. Each one was modest. Each one was supported by data. Each one simply asked that humanity receive a portion of the sectors they had personally explored and mapped. The first amendment was voted down 11-3. The second was voted down 12-2. By the fourth, some delegations were not even bothering to formally vote against it. They simply turned away, their attention elsewhere, as if the human ambassador was background noise. She stood through all of it. She did not raise her voice. She did not pound the podium. She simply presented each amendment, watched it fail, and moved to the next one. Her face showed nothing, but her hands hidden behind the podium were pressed flat against the surface so hard that her fingers had gone white. After the 7th Amendment failed, the Valith ambassador rose. Her name was High Delegate Sorath, and she moved with the slow grace of someone who had never been told no in her entire life. She did not look at Mwangi directly. She looked past her, as if addressing the chamber itself. The Council appreciates the enthusiasm of the Terran delegation, Sorath said, her voice carrying the musical tone that all Valith shared. However, frontier allocation has always been determined by civilizational maturity, not by the eagerness of youth. The Terran species is still learning. There will be other opportunities in time. There was a murmur of agreement from the elder bloc. Some of the smaller species stayed quiet. They knew better than to speak up. After the session ended, Mwangi walked through the curved corridors of the station toward the human delegation's quarters. The halls were wide enough for every body type in the galaxy, from the tiny Tessai, who barely reached her knee, to the enormous Orun, who needed doorways the size of aircraft hangars. She passed delegates from a dozen species. Some nodded politely. Most did not acknowledge her at all. She was halfway to her quarters when a voice stopped her. Ambassador Mwangi. She turned. High Delegate Sarath stood behind her, alone, without her usual escort of advisors. The Veilith woman looked down at Mwangi with eyes that were entirely black, like polished stones. I wanted to speak with you privately, Sarath said, away from the formalities. Of course, High Delegate. Sarath stepped closer. When she spoke, her musical voice was quieter, almost gentle, and that somehow made her words worse. You must understand something, Ambassador. Your species has done admirable work. Your disaster relief efforts are noted. Your contributions to the Shral peacekeeping mission are noted. Your scientific collaborations are noted. All of this is in the record. And yet none of it mattered today, Mwangi said. Sarath tilted her head, a Veilith gesture that could mean sympathy or pity. On her, it looked like pity. You are tolerated, Ambassador, not respected. I tell you this not to be cruel, but to be honest. The sooner your species learns the difference, the easier your time in this council will be. Stop reaching for things that are not meant for you, and you will find your position here quite comfortable. She turned and walked away without waiting for a response. Her footsteps made no sound on the polished floor. Mwangi stood alone in the corridor for a long time. Then she walked to her quarters, sat down at her private terminal, and composed a message to Earth. It was short and encrypted on the highest channel available to the Terran Diplomatic Corps. It contained no details about the vote, no summary of the amendments, no political analysis. It was one line. They have made their position clear. She sent it and sat in the silence of her room. Through the viewport, the stars burned cold and distant, the same stars humanity had dreamed about since they first looked up from the plains of Africa. The same stars they had reached for, with rockets held together by hope and mathematics. The same stars that the Galactic Council had just told them they did not deserve. The next morning, Mwangi returned to the Grand Chamber. She stood at the speaking platform and requested a 72-hour recess before the final ratification of the Frontier Rights Policy. Her voice was calm and professional. Her face showed nothing. The elder species granted the recess without discussion. The Kirath ambassador made a clicking sound that passed for laughter among his kind. The Arun delegate had already turned away. High Delegate Sarath simply nodded, the way one might nod at a child who had asked for a few more minutes before bedtime. None of them understood what was coming. None of them even thought to wonder. The message from Ambassador Mwangi arrived on Earth at 3 a.m, Geneva time. By 4, every member of the United Terran Authority's Inner Council had been woken up. By 5, they were seated around a table in a room buried deep beneath the old city, a room that had no windows and no name on any map. Director General Tomas Herrera sat at the head of the table. He was 63 years old, a quiet man with deep lines on his face, and hands that had once built houses before they signed treaties. He read Mwangi's message aloud, just the one line, and then he set his tablet down and looked at the people around him. We all knew this day might come, he said. The question is whether we are ready. The room was silent for a moment. Then Admiral Priya Chandrasekharan, head of the Terran Defense Coordination, opened a folder on the table in front of her. The folder was labeled Quiet Exodus, and it had been updated every 6 months for the past 12 years. We are ready, she said. The debate lasted 4 hours. Not because anyone disagreed with the decision, but because everyone understood how heavy it was. They were not talking about war. They were not talking about sanctions or threats or shows of force. They were talking about something much simpler and much harder. They were talking about leaving. Walking away from 40 years of membership. walking away from alliances, trade agreements, research partnerships, and humanitarian missions. Walking away from a seat at the only table that mattered in the galaxy. Walking away from everything humanity had worked for since first contact, simply because that table had never really wanted them there. When the vote came, it was unanimous. Some of them were shaking. Director General Herrera picked up his secure communicator and sent 2 words back to Mwangi aboard the council station. Begin withdrawal. What happened next was something the galaxy had never seen before. Not because it was violent or dramatic, but because it was the opposite. Humanity left the Galactic Council the same way they had done everything else in their 40 years of membership. Quietly, thoroughly, and with more care than anyone expected or deserved. Aboard the council station, Mwangi called her entire staff together. 37 people, diplomats and analysts and translators and cultural advisors, gathered in the human delegation's common room. She told them the decision. Some cried. Most just nodded. They had felt this coming for years. Then they got to work. Every file was organized. Every ongoing negotiation was documented with full notes, so the other parties could continue without confusion. Every shared project was handed off with complete records, timelines, and recommendations for next steps. Nothing was deleted. Nothing was locked. Nothing was sabotaged. The humans packed their personal belongings, cleaned their offices, and left them in better condition than they had found them. Across the galaxy, the same thing was happening everywhere humans had a presence. On the border world of Shral, where 2 alien species had been locked in a bitter territorial war for decades, a team of 48 human peacekeepers had been maintaining the ceasefire. They were the only neutral force both sides trusted, because humans had no interest in the territory and no history with either faction. Captain Marcus Okafor, who led the peacekeeping team, spent his last day visiting both sides of the border. He shook hands and clasped claws and touched foreheads in the local custom. He gave each side copies of every patrol report, every mediation record, every agreement they had signed. He wished them well and meant it. That evening, the peacekeepers boarded their transport. A young Shral soldier on the eastern side of the border watched the human ship rise into the sky and felt something cold settle in his chest, though he could not yet name what it was. On Oruan Prime, a team of human xenobiologists had been working for 8 years in a research hospital, studying alien diseases and finding treatments that combined human medical creativity with Oruan biotechnology. Dr. Amara Diallo, the team leader, spent her last week training her Oruan colleagues on every ongoing experiment. She transferred every piece of data, every hypothesis, every half-finished idea she had scribbled on napkins during late nights in the lab. When her Oruan counterpart, a massive being named Groth, asked her why she was being so thorough, she looked up at him and said, "Because the patients matter more than politics." Groth watched her leave and stood in the empty lab for a long time afterward, surrounded by equipment that suddenly felt incomplete. Across 12 star systems, human engineers who maintained alien infrastructure finished their shifts, filed their final reports, and left. On the Kirath station of Nexus 7, a human engineer named Yuki Tanaka spent her last hour fixing a coolant leak that nobody had asked her to fix. When a Kirath worker clicked at her in confusion, asking why she was still working when she was supposed to be leaving, she just shrugged and said, "Because it needed fixing." The trade agreements were the most complex part. Humanity had embedded itself into dozens of economic relationships over 4 decades, buying and selling goods and technologies with species across the Council. But buried deep in every single trade agreement, in the fine print that no alien lawyer had ever bothered to read carefully, were exit clauses, legal, clean, and completely binding. Humanity had put them there at the very beginning, as if some part of them had always known this day might come. Now they invoked every single one. The termination notices were polite. The language was formal, Every obligation was fulfilled to the letter. Every debt was paid. Every contract was honored through its exit terms. There was nothing to argue about, nothing to contest, nothing to be angry at. It was perfect, and it was devastating. 72 hours. That was all it took. In 72 hours, humanity erased its presence from the Galactic Council with the precision of surgeons and the silence of snow falling on water. On the final day, Ambassador Mwangi walked through the corridors of the Council Station one last time. She passed the Grand Chamber, where the elder species were already discussing the frontier rights ratification, as if the recess had been nothing but a brief pause. She passed the quarters of species she had worked with for 15 years. She passed the memorial wall, where the names of diplomats who had died in service were carved in 100 alien scripts. 12 of those names were human. She stopped at the docking port, where the last Terran shuttle waited. Her staff was already aboard. She turned and looked back down the corridor. It was empty. No one had come to see them off. No one had asked them to stay. The door closed behind her. Outside the station, the Terran diplomatic vessel Perseverance waited in the silence of space. One by one, across the galaxy, human ships were doing the same thing. Lifting off from alien worlds, undocking from foreign stations, turning toward home. No fleet formations, no dramatic flybys, just single ships here and there, slipping away like threads pulled from a tapestry. The Kirath ambassador heard the news that the humans had departed, and made his clicking laugh again. A tantrum, he said to his aides. They will be back within a season. Young species always come back. The Orun delegation barely acknowledged the departure. They had more important things to think about. High Delegate Sorath of the Valith received the notification on her personal terminal. She read it, closed the message, and returned to her work. She did not think one was necessary. In the black space beyond the Council Station, the engine trails of the Perseverance faded slowly into nothing. And then there was only the dark, and the stars, and a silence that was deeper than anyone realized. The humans were gone. And not a single species in the Galactic Council understood what that actually meant. The first 3 months were easy. The galaxy barely noticed the humans were gone. The Galactic Council ratified the frontier rights policy without a single change. The elder species divided the Orion Spur among themselves exactly as they had planned. The Valith took the richest sectors. The Kirath took the most strategic ones. The Orun took the largest. The smaller species received whatever scraps were left, which was the way it had always been, and the way the elder species believed it would always be. In the hallways and meeting rooms of the Council Station, the space where humans used to work was quietly absorbed. Their offices were reassigned. Their seats in the Grand Chamber were removed, to make room for a new decorative installation. A Valith artist created a sculpture of intertwined crystal rings to fill the gap. It was very beautiful. It meant nothing. Then the cracks began to show. The first crack appeared on the Shral border. For 30 years, the conflict between the Shral Eastern Federation and the Shral Western Compact had been held in check by human peacekeepers. The ceasefire was fragile, built on trust that both sides had in the humans, and in no one else. Without the peacekeepers, that trust had nothing to stand on. The first shooting happened 11 weeks after the humans left. A border patrol from the east crossed a line that a patrol from the west said was theirs. Words were exchanged, then energy weapons were fired. 3 soldiers died. Within a week, both sides had mobilized their armies. The Galactic Council sent Kirath mediators to restore order. The Kirath were efficient and logical. They arrived with detailed proposals and timetables for negotiation. Both Shral factions refused to meet with them. The Eastern Federation's general said it plainly. The Kirath have trade agreements with the West. They are not neutral. Send us the humans. Nobody could send the humans. The Kirath mediators stood in empty rooms and waited for meetings that never happened. Within 3 months, the Shral border war had fully reignited, and soldiers were dying every day. The second crack appeared on Orun Prime. A new variant of a fungal plague emerged in the agricultural provinces of the Orun homeworld. This was not unusual. The Orun were old, and their world was old, and plagues came and went like seasons. Normally, the Orun Biomedical Corps handled these outbreaks, with their vast libraries of genetic treatments. But this variant was different. It had mutated in a way that their standard approaches could not address, and it was spreading fast. For the past 8 years, human xenobiologists had been working alongside the Orun medical teams. The humans had a strange talent for medicine that no other species fully understood. They combined treatments from completely different biological frameworks. They guessed, and their guesses were right far more often than mathematics said they should be. Dr. Amara Diallo and her team had solved 3 previously untreatable conditions during their time on Orun Prime, not through superior technology, but through a kind of creative thinking that the Orun's methodical minds simply could not replicate. Now the humans were gone, and the plague was here, and the Orun Medical Corps stood in the laboratory that Diallo had left perfectly organized, and realized that they could read her notes but could not follow her thinking. The leaps she had made from one idea to another were invisible to them. It was like looking at a bridge that had no supports. They could see it standing, but they could not understand why it did not fall. The plague spread. 6,000 Orun died in the first wave, 12,000 in the second. The Orun hegemony, too proud to ask for help, said nothing to the council. The third crack was quieter and deeper, and it happened inside the Valith Dominion. For decades, the Valith had been buying a particular component from human manufacturers: quantum relay nodes. These were small devices, no bigger than a fist, that served as the backbone of faster-than-light communication networks. They were not glamorous. They were not prestigious. No Valith engineer wanted to spend their career making them, because the work was repetitive and the profit margins were thin. But they were essential. Every message, every data transfer, every financial transaction in the Valith Dominion passed through quantum relay nodes. Humans had been making them cheaply and reliably for 30 years. They were good at this kind of work, the unglamorous, necessary, invisible labor that kept systems running. Now the supply was gone, and the existing nodes had a limited lifespan. The Valith began searching for alternatives. Other species made similar components, but they cost 8 times more and had longer production times. The Valith Engineering Council estimated it would take 4 to 6 years to build their own manufacturing capacity. In the meantime, their communication networks would slowly degrade. 6 months after the human departure, message delays began appearing across the Dominion. A financial transaction that used to take seconds now took minutes. Military communications that had been instant now arrived with gaps. The Valith public did not know why their networks were slowing down, but the Valith government knew, and they did not want to talk about it. Across the council, in 100 smaller ways, the same pattern repeated. Research projects stalled because the human scientists who had connected different alien disciplines were no longer there. Engineering problems went unsolved because the human technicians who had maintained the obscure systems were gone. Cultural exchange programs collapsed because humans had been the ones organizing them, doing the thankless work of translation and coordination that no other species had the patience for. And the smaller species suffered most of all. The Tesai, a gentle people barely 2 feet tall, with enormous dark eyes and soft voices, had relied on humanity more than anyone. In the council chamber, the Tesai had no power. Their world was small. Their military was almost non-existent. Their economy was modest. When they spoke, the elder species did not listen. But the humans had listened. Human diplomats had carried Tessie proposals to the floor. Human advocates had argued for Tessie interests in committee meetings. Human trade ships had carried Tessie goods to markets that the Tessie could never have reached alone. Without the humans, the Tessie were invisible again. Counselor Rin was young for a Tessie diplomat, barely 40 years old in a species that lived to 300. She had dark fur and wide amber eyes, and a quiet way of moving that made people forget she was in the room. She had spent the first months after the human departure watching and listening and saying very little. Now she began to work. Rin started compiling a report. She went through every council record she could access, every trade ledger, every mission log, every scientific publication, and she began counting. She counted the number of humanitarian missions humanity had run. She counted the number of alien lives saved by human medical teams. She counted the economic value of human trade goods, human engineering labor, human scientific contributions. She counted the diplomatic interventions, the mediations, the compromises that humans had brokered between species who would not speak to each other. The numbers were enormous, not because any single contribution was extraordinary, but because there were so many of them, spread across so many years, woven into so many systems. Humanity had not been a pillar of the council. They had been the mortar between every brick, invisible, but holding everything together. Rin finished her report 18 months after the human departure. She formatted it simply, without opinion or editorial. Just numbers, just facts. She sent it to every delegation in the council. Most ignored it. The Kireth dismissed it as emotional manipulation. The Orun were too busy fighting their plague to read it. But High Delegate Sorath of the Valith read every page. She read it in her private quarters, late at night, with her communication network flickering around her, and the news feeds full of the Shral War and the Oruan Plague, and a dozen other problems that were getting worse every day. When she finished, she set the report down and stared at the wall for a very long time. The crystal sculpture in the grand chamber, the one that had replaced the human seats, suddenly seemed very small and very foolish. For the first time in her long career, High Delegate Sorath felt something she had never felt before. She felt afraid, not of the humans, not of what they might do, but of what the galaxy looked like without them. And the worst part, the part that kept her awake long into the night, was the knowledge that the humans had not taken anything with them when they left. They had not locked their files, or destroyed their work, or stolen their technology back. They had left everything behind, open and freely available. A gift that said more clearly than words ever could, "We were never your enemies. We were the best friends you ever had, and you told us we were not welcome." 18 months after the humans left, the Galactic Council called an emergency session. This had not happened in over a century. The last emergency session had been during the Muldari extinction event, when an asteroid had nearly wiped out an entire species. The fact that one was being called now, with no asteroid in sight, told everyone in the galaxy exactly how bad things had become. The Grand Chamber was full. Every species sent their highest-ranking delegates. The observation galleries were packed. News drones from 100 worlds hovered near the ceiling, broadcasting to billions of beings who wanted to know what the Council planned to do about the mess they were in. The Shral War was the most visible crisis. 40,000 soldiers had died in 18 months. Refugee ships were flooding into neighboring systems. 2 Council member species had closed their borders entirely, creating a humanitarian disaster in the space between. The war had no end in sight, because neither side would accept mediation from anyone except the humans, and the humans were not there. The Orun Plague was the most deadly crisis. The fungal variant had spread to 3 provinces and killed over 90,000 people. The Orun had finally swallowed their pride and asked the Council for help, but no other species had the right combination of knowledge and creativity to crack the mutation. Several alien medical teams had tried. They had all failed. The Orun were dying, and they were dying because the one species that could have saved them had been told they were not welcome at the table. The Valith communications crisis was the most politically dangerous. Relay nodes were failing across the Dominion at an increasing rate. Financial markets had slowed. Military coordination was degrading. The public was asking questions, and the government was running out of answers that did not involve admitting they had been dependent on a species they had publicly humiliated. High Delegate Sorath stood at the central platform of the Grand Chamber. She looked older than she had 18 months ago. The silver of her skin seemed duller, and the musical quality of her voice had a flatness to it that her aides had never heard before. She presented the situation in careful, measured terms. She did not mention the humans by name. She spoke only of resource gaps and unforeseen logistical challenges. Everyone in the room knew what she really meant. The debate that followed lasted 9 hours. The Kirath ambassador, whose clicking laughter had been noticeably absent for months, proposed a resolution. It was drafted in the traditional language of council diplomacy, the old formal style that the elder species had used for millennia. It read, "The Galactic Council graciously extends renewed provisional membership to the Terran species, contingent upon immediate resumption of all prior obligations, commitments, and service agreements as previously maintained under their former membership status." In simple language, it said, "Come back and do everything you were doing before, under the same terms, with the same lack of respect, as if nothing had happened." The resolution passed with a large majority. Only the Tessai and a handful of smaller species voted against it. Councillor Rin, watching from her small seat in the upper galleries, closed her eyes when the vote was announced. She had known it would pass. She had also known it would fail. The message was transmitted to Earth on the fastest channel available. Then, the council waited. 1 day passed, then 2, then 3. The Kirath ambassador said the delay was a negotiating tactic. The Orun said the humans were probably arguing among themselves, as young species often did. Sorath said nothing. She sat in her quarters and stared at her flickering communication screens, and waited. On the 6th day, the response arrived. It was 3 sentences long. The United Terran Authority acknowledges the Council's communication. Humanity's departure was not a negotiation. When the Council is prepared to discuss equal partnership, our channel remains open. The Grand Chamber fell silent when the message was read aloud. It was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of a room full of powerful beings who had just realized, perhaps for the first time, that power was not the same as control. The Kirath ambassador broke the silence first. He proposed economic sanctions against human colonies, cut off their trade with independent systems, pressure them financially until they had no choice but to return. His clicking was rapid and aggressive, the sound a Kirath made when they were angry and frightened at the same time. The Council's economic advisors pulled the data. What they found made the room go quiet again. In the 18 months since leaving the Council, humanity had not been sitting idle. They had been building. Quietly, without announcements or fanfare, human trade ships had established commercial relationships with dozens of independent systems, species and civilizations that existed outside Council jurisdiction. These were frontier worlds, mining colonies, free stations, and nomadic fleets that the Council had always considered too small to matter. Humanity had connected them into a loose but growing economic network that did not need the Council at all. The sanctions proposal was withdrawn. There was nothing to sanction. They sent a private request to Earth for the medical data related to the plague variant. They offered to pay handsomely for it. Earth's response was immediate and confusing. The data was already available. Dr. Diallo had left every file, every dataset, every research note, open and accessible on the Aruan hospital servers. The information was there. It had always been there. The problem was not access. The problem was understanding. The Aruan scientists could read the data, but could not follow the logic. Diallo's methods involved intuitive connections between completely unrelated biological systems, leaps of reasoning that no Aruan scientist could replicate because their minds did not work that way. It was not a matter of intelligence. The Aruan were brilliant. It was a matter of perspective. Humans saw patterns that other species simply could not see. Not because other species were lesser, but because human brains had evolved in a strange and specific way, on a strange and specific world. And that strangeness had value. The Aruan could not save themselves with human data alone. They needed human minds. 3 weeks after the failed resolution, Councillor Rin requested permission to address the full council. This was unusual. The Tesai rarely spoke in the Grand Chamber. When they did, the elder species usually talked over them or left for refreshments. But something had changed. The smaller species, the ones who had suffered most from humanity's absence, had begun gathering around Rin. The Tesai, the Breen, the Moldari, the Fennec, a dozen small civilizations that had always been ignored. Together, they called themselves the Coalition of Emerging Species, and they had chosen Rin as their voice. She was so small that the automated podium had to lower itself to its minimum height, and even then, her head barely cleared the top. She looked out at the vast chamber with her wide amber eyes, and she spoke in a voice that was soft but carried to every corner of the room. "I want to tell you what the humans did for my people," she said. "Not because they were asked, not because they were paid, not because it earned them power or prestige. They did it because they saw us, and they thought we mattered." She described how human trade ships had carried Tesai medical supplies during a famine, how human diplomats had spent weeks learning the Tesai language so they could present Tesai concerns accurately in committee. How a human engineer named Yuki Tanaka had once spent her personal leave rebuilding a water purification system on a Tesai colony, not because it was her job, but because she had visited the colony and seen children drinking dirty water. The humans did not leave because they were weak, Rin said. They left because they were the only ones in this chamber strong enough to walk away from a table that disrespected them, and still leave every door open behind them. They did not take their knowledge, they did not take their data, they did not take their goodwill. They left it all for us, freely, because that is who they are. She paused, and looked directly at High Delegate Sorath. The question is not whether we want them back. The question is whether we deserve to ask. The chamber was silent. Rin stepped down from the platform and returned to her seat. Nobody spoke for a long time. That night, High Delegate Sorath sat alone in her quarters. She had served the Valith Dominion for 200 years. She had negotiated treaties with empires that no longer existed. She had never apologized for anything, because apology was not a concept the Valith respected. To apologize was to admit weakness, and to admit weakness was to invite destruction. But the galaxy was already being destroyed, slowly and quietly, by the absence of a species that had never once raised a weapon against anyone in this council. Sorath opened her personal terminal, not the diplomatic channel, not the official council communication system. Her personal terminal, the one she used to write to her family. She composed a message to Ambassador Alara Mwangi. It was not from the Valith Dominion. It was not from the Galactic Council. It was from one person to another. It said, "I was wrong. Tell me what equal looks like." She sent it before she could change her mind, and then she sat in the quiet of her room and waited for an answer she was not sure she deserved. 3 years after the humans walked away from the Galactic Council, a message went out to every species in known space. It was not sent from the Council station at Verath Prime. It was sent from a human deep space station called Arcadia, a modest but well-built structure orbiting a yellow star in Terran frontier space. The message was an invitation to negotiate the terms of humanity's return to galactic affairs. The location was deliberate. If the galaxy wanted humans back, the galaxy would come to them. The symbolism was understood by everyone. Ambassador Alara Mwangi stood in the observation deck of Arcadia and watched the ships arrive. She was 3 years older now, and those years showed in the gray at her temples and the deeper lines around her eyes. But her back was straight and her gaze was steady, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of a species that had learned the hardest lesson the galaxy could teach. That sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was nothing at all. The Valith delegation arrived first. High Delegate Sorath stepped off her shuttle and onto the human station with a slowness that was not her usual grace, but something closer to humility. She had exchanged several private messages with Mwangi over the past year, and those conversations had changed her in ways she was still trying to understand. She was the same woman who had once told Mwangi that humans were tolerated, not respected. She did not feel like the same woman anymore. The Oruans sent their head of sciences, a massive being named Groth, the same researcher who had worked alongside Dr. Diallo before the departure. The Orun hegemony had finally contained their plague, but it had taken them 2 years and 200,000 lives, and the solution they had found was crude compared to what Diallo could have developed in months. Groth carried that knowledge with him like a stone in his chest. The Kiraths sent a young ambassador named Chiral. She was from a new generation, hatched and raised in the years after the human departure. She had grown up watching the consequences of her elders' arrogance, watching the Shral War burn, watching the economy stutter, watching the council pretend that everything was fine while everything fell apart. She did not carry her predecessors' contempt. She carried their shame, and she was determined to do something useful with it. And Counselor Rin was there. She sat at the negotiating table as the representative of the Coalition of Emerging Species, a block of 32 smaller civilizations that had formed in the wake of humanity's departure. 3 years ago, the Tessai had been invisible. Now, Rin spoke for a third of the Council's membership. That too was something humanity had made possible, not by fighting for the small species, but by leaving a gap so large that the small species had been forced to find their own voice. The negotiations were held in a circular room with wide windows that looked out on the stars. The table was round. There was no head position. Every seat was the same height, even the one built for Rin, which had been carefully designed so that she sat at the same eye level as everyone else. Mwangi had insisted on this. She had insisted on all of it. The first day was the hardest. Humanity did not come to a table with demands for revenge or reparations. They did not ask for apologies, though several delegations tried to offer them. They did not ask for special treatment or elevated status, or any of the privileges that the elder species had hoarded for millennia. What they asked for was something much more difficult. They asked for change. Mwangi presented 4 proposals. She spoke calmly, without emotion, laying out each one as if she were describing the weather. The first proposal was full and equal voting rights for every member species, regardless of how long they had been in the council. No more weighted votes based on age of membership. A civilization that joined yesterday would have the same voice as one that had been there for 10,000 years. The second proposal was an independent body to oversee resource allocation, made up of representatives from every tier of species, with the power to review and reject any decision made by the Elder Block. No more backroom deals. No more dividing the galaxy's wealth among the powerful while the rest watched. The third proposal was a formal charter of mutual obligation. If a species benefited from another species' contributions, that benefit would be acknowledged publicly and recorded permanently. No more invisible labor. No more thankless work. Every contribution would be seen. The fourth proposal was a new system for frontier rights, based on demonstrated stewardship rather than political seniority. If a species explored a sector, mapped it, and showed they could develop it responsibly, the rights were theirs. The galaxy belonged to those who cared for it, not to those who simply arrived first. Sorath listened to each proposal with her hands folded in her lap. The old version of her would have rejected all four without discussion. Voting equality was an insult to civilizational achievement. Independent oversight was a challenge to Valith authority. Public acknowledgement of contributions was unnecessary sentimentality. Stewardship-based allocation was naive idealism. But the old version of her had driven away the only species that had held the galaxy together, and the galaxy had nearly collapsed as a result. The old version of her had been wrong, and she knew it now with a certainty that settled into her bones like cold water. "These terms are acceptable as a basis for negotiation," she said. The Kirath delegate, Chiral, clicked softly in agreement. Groth of the Orowin simply nodded, his massive head dipping in a gesture that, for the Orowin, was the equivalent of bowing. The negotiations lasted 3 weeks. Every proposal was debated, refined, challenged, and reshaped. The elder species pushed back on details. Humanity held firm on principles, but showed flexibility on implementation. Rin and the coalition fought for provisions that protected the smallest species. Sorath, to the surprise of everyone including herself, became one of the strongest advocates for the independent oversight body, arguing that the Valith had been making decisions unchecked for too long, and that accountability would make them stronger, not weaker. There were difficult moments. There were late nights and raised voices, and sessions that ended with delegates walking out of the room to cool down in the corridors. But nobody walked away from the table entirely. Nobody left. That, in itself, was the lesson humanity had taught them. On the 22nd day, the document was finished. They called it the Arcadia Accords. It was written in every language of every species at the table, including Tesai, which had never before been used in a galactic treaty. Rin wept when she saw her language on the document. She wept quietly, in the Tesai way, with her small hands pressed against her chest, and her amber eyes bright with tears. The signing ceremony was simple. No grand speeches, no fanfare. Each delegate stepped forward, applied their species form of signature, and stepped back. Sorath used the Valith touch seal, pressing her silver palm against the document. Groth used the Orun voice mark, speaking his name in a tone so low that the humans felt it in their chests rather than heard it. Chiral used the Kirath scent glyph, a chemical mark that would last for centuries. Mwangi signed last. She used a pen, an old-fashioned earth pen with black ink, the kind that humans had been using for thousands of years. She wrote her name in steady letters, and when she lifted the pen, the room was quiet. Humanity was back, not as provisional members, not as junior partners tolerated by ancient civilizations. They were back as equals, as architects of a new system, as the species that had been brave enough to leave and wise enough to come back only when the terms were right. After the ceremony, the delegates filed out of the signing room in small groups, talking quietly among themselves. The corridors of Arcadia were busy with staff and security and journalists from 100 worlds, all trying to capture the moment. But in a quiet corner, near the observation deck, away from the crowds, Counselor Rin found Ambassador Mwangi standing alone by the windows, looking out at the stars. Rin walked up beside her. The Tesai diplomat barely reached Mwangi's waist, but when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of everything they had both been through. "Can I ask you something?" Rin said. "Of course. Were you afraid, when you walked away from the council 3 years ago, were you afraid that no one would come after you?" She looked out at the stars for a long time. The same stars that humanity had always looked at. The same ones they had dreamed about when they were still young and earthbound and full of hope that the universe would welcome them. Every day, she said finally. Every single day, I was afraid. There were mornings when I woke up and thought we had made the worst mistake in human history. There were nights when I lay awake and wondered if the galaxy would simply forget we existed. She paused and looked down at Rin. But my grandmother taught me something when I was very young. She said, never stay where you are not valued, and never return until you are. She said the hardest part is not the leaving. The hardest part is trusting that your absence will speak louder than your voice ever could. Rin looked up at her with those wide amber eyes. And does it? Does the absence speak louder? It was a tired smile. The smile of a woman who had carried the weight of her species' dignity on her shoulders for 3 years, and had only just set it down. It always does, she said. Outside the windows of Arcadia, the stars burned on. Somewhere among them, on 100 worlds and 1,000 stations, beings of every shape and size and color were reading the news of the Arcadia Accords. Some were celebrating. Some were skeptical. Some were already planning how to test the new system's limits. But on a small Tessi colony at the edge of known space, a water purification system that a human engineer had once built during her personal leave was still running perfectly, still providing clean water to children who had never met the woman who built it and never would. And on Orun Prime, in a laboratory that had been empty for 3 years, a team of Orun scientists were preparing a room for the human researchers who would soon return. And on the Shral border, where the guns had only recently gone silent, a young soldier on the eastern side looked up at the sky and thought he saw a human ship passing overhead, though he could not be sure. The galaxy was not healed. It would take years, maybe decades, before the wounds of the last 3 years fully closed. But for the first time, since the humans had walked away in silence, the future felt like something worth building. And that, in the end, was the most human thing of all.